After we talked about how the history is created to be, and now we're going to be talking about how the fall has affected history in chapter 22. So it starts off quoting John 8:44 through 45. So I'll read that for you. It says, "Ye are of your father the devil, and the lusts of your father you will do. He was a murderer from the beginning, and abode not in the truth, because there is no truth in him. When he speaketh a lie, he speaketh of his own, for he is a liar and the father of it. And because I tell you the truth, ye believe me not." So the Pharisees rejected Jesus because they wanted to believe their own truth, which was really a lie. And that's because they came from their father, the devil, like all of us do without Christ. And it talks about how this is something that has occurred from the very beginning. Satan gave a false historical narrative. He said, "Did God really tell you this? What did God tell you?" Talking about the past. Adam gave a historical narrative when he talks about why he sinned. He said that the serpent gave it to his wife, and then his wife gave it to him. And he emphasized the parts that backed up his position. And that's what many historians do. So they included facts, both Satan and Adam, but they reinterpreted those facts and left out the ones that didn't support their argument. They selected and arranged the facts in a way that would support their argument. And this is what many historians do. And this is one of the hardest parts about history, is the fact that most historians recount true events. But the problem is how they interpret those events and what events they choose to emphasize and what events they choose to leave out. And that's how the fall many times affects our history. So we have to realize that history and the past are not the same. What do I mean by that? Well, the past is everything that has ever happened. History, like we talked about in the last chapter, is taking and selecting certain events from the past and then making models based on those selected events and interpretations of those events to convey something to those people that are reading or watching or listening to that history. So history takes the past and interprets it and uses it for a specific goal, picking and choosing what parts it's going to emphasize and what parts it's going to leave out. We have to realize historians are never neutral. They always are going to interpret based on their ideologies. This goes all the way back to what we talked about at the very beginning of the course and the idea of worldview. All of us have a worldview, and in that worldview we have a big story that we tell ourselves about the world that helps us then come to some basic beliefs and that we see everything through. And that's going to affect how we do history. It's going to affect how we see history and how we interpret historical things in the past. So there are four major views that we're going to talk about in the first section, 22a, that are all in some way skewing history. First is naturalism, then nationalism, postmodernism, and then finally class, race, and gender. So the first one we're going to talk about is naturalism. So with naturalism, you have what they are emphasizing here is nature. That's why it's called naturalism. And in the book, it uses the example of a really famous book called Guns, Germs, and Steel, written by Jared Diamond. And basically what Jared Diamond tries to do in that book is he tries to explain why certain cultures, for example, the Incas, were conquered by other cultures like the Spanish. Was it because the Spanish were better than the Incas? They were more intelligent or stronger? What was the cause of that? And what he says was the cause of that was simply the fact that the Spanish, the environment in Europe, was much more conducive to success than the environment in South America. So since in Europe they had better farmland, they had better food and better resources, because of their resources, they were able to spend a lot more time training for battle and developing weapons and doing all of those things because of the environment in which they found themselves. So he would say that the environment what caused these differences. So in naturalism, basically what they say is humans and their civilizations are merely the products of nature operating according to physical laws of cause and effect. So really, this becomes everything that happens in history simply happens because of the environment. So whatever happens in history happens because of the environment. So the reason why certain civilizations conquered others is because of their location and resources, and this is what we call naturalistic determinism. Everything is determined not by people's choices or morality, but simply by the environment. So cultures are determined solely on their environment. They have really no ability to change because it just depends on their environment. This has a good goal, and its goal is to get rid of racism that says certain cultures are better than other cultures. But in trying to get rid of racism, really what it does is it gets rid of morality. And it really doesn't solve the problem of racism, because the problem of racism doesn't come from looking at the environment. The problem of racism comes from the human heart, and not understanding that everyone is created in God's image and the pride and the selfishness of the human heart. So the problems with naturalism, three major problems. First of all, it fails to realize that the morality of leaders, and sometimes the people that choose or allow the leaders to be the leaders, has a huge effect on the prosperity of that civilization. So for example, Proverbs 29:4 says, "By justice a kingdom builds up the land, but he who exacts gifts tears it down." So when there's a lot of bribery and selfishness and corruption in the government, that causes the people to suffer and the society not to progress. And this is what we've seen in societies like Venezuela, where they have incredible natural resources. They have tons of oil and a lot of other incredible natural resources. And for a time when they were under good government, they succeeded. But then when the government became evil, they're now in poverty, and people are leaving it in droves. And it wasn't because of their environment, it was because of bad leadership. Also, there are many countries and many civilizations that have found themselves in very poor environments, but because of their technology, they have been able to improve their situation. For example, in 2 Chronicles, it talks about how Hezekiah was without water. He was in Jerusalem, a very poor environment, but he used technology to reroute water into the city and thereby solve the problem of the environment. So 2 Chronicles chapter 32 and verse 30 talks about this, and it says that, "For this same Hezekiah closed the upper outlet of the waters of Gihon and directed them down to the west side of the city of David, and Hezekiah prospered in all his works." We see the same thing that happens with North Korea and South Korea. North Korea is actually an incredibly rich land. In fact, the reason why North Korea stayed with North Korea was because that was for most people, considered it the better part of Korea as far as land and resources. And yet, South Korea is by far the richer, more successful Korea. It's not because of the natural resources, it's because of the freedom, the technology that they have been able to do. The same thing we can see with many other nations like Japan that are very, very small, or even nations like Singapore or tiny island have almost no resources and yet have succeeded incredibly because of technology and because of choices and leadership. The third thing we have to realize is that causation is very complex. Did Diamond have any truth to the fact that our environment affects history? Of course. The environment definitely has an effect on history. But the question is, how much of an effect? And is that the main factor or the only factor? Obviously, there are a lot of other factors that go into the prosperity of a civilization besides the environment. The environment is definitely a factor, but it's not the only factor because causation is very complex. And many times when we blame all of history on the environment, it instead of helping people, it paralyzes them. So for example, nations today that are third world countries, if they're only third world countries because of their environment, then they have no hope. They will never become better because it's their environment. But if the morality of the leaders, if technology, if hard work can make any country improve and become a successful country, then that gives hope to people. So really, Diamond's idea of getting rid of racism actually brings hopelessness, because there's no way that any country can succeed unless it has good resources. And that's a major problem. So that's nationalism. The second wrong way of viewing history is nationalism. What is nationalism? Well, nationalism is simply looking at your country and saying, my country is the best country in every way, and my country, every other country, is trash, to put it mildly. So lifting up the independence of a nation or ethnic group as the ultimate good. So the best possible thing is for my country to be independent of any other country. That's the best possible good. The worst thing that could happen would be that my country would be under the control of another country. So again, it has some good aspects. It's good to be thankful and grateful for the good aspects of the culture that I live in. And that's a good thing. But the problem is it can end up creating an idol out of your nation when you think your nation is better than every other nation in every other way. Obviously, in the first instance, that's impossible, logically speaking. Every nation cannot be better than every other nation in a way. And it is very improbable that one nation will be better than every other nation in every possible way. So we have to recognize that even just logically speaking, there will be other nations that are better than our nation in different ways, and be truthful about that. Proverbs 14:34 says, righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a reproach to any nation. So we have to realize any nation is affected by sin, and any nation can have those problems. So many nationalities in other countries think their salvation is going to come from having their own country. If I can just be free from the country that's over me, then everything will be perfect. Now, again, is freedom a good thing? Yes. Is it good for nations to be able to be free from rule by other nations? Yes. But it's not the ultimate good. And it doesn't solve their problems. And we've seen many nations that have become free from other nations, but then have ended up being worse than they were before. The picture there is of a kamikaze pilot. World War II, a big reason why World War II happened is because of the nationalism in Germany and in Japan. Both countries believing that their country was superior to every other country, and therefore they couldn't lose, and therefore it was their right and really their duty to force their culture on every other culture. Now, we have to make sure we distinguish between three different ways of viewing our country and our culture. On the far left, we have the correct way of viewing our culture, which is patriotism. Patriotism is a good thing. It is good to be thankful for the good things that our culture has done. That could be, for all of you come from different cultures. I know some of you come from the Philippines, or some of you come from Nigeria, or from Cuba, or from other countries. And each one of these countries has good things about it. Even the worst of countries that are under the worst leadership, like North Korea or other countries like that, have a lot of good things about their land, about the people in their land, about some of their customs, about even some of the things that their leadership has done. So it's good to recognize the good in our cultures, the good food that they make, the beautiful features of the land, the brave acts of heroes in the past. All of those things that our cultures have in them, we should be proud of. And we should be thankful to God for. And it's also good to be unified around these common beliefs and values, and feel like I'm part of a community, and I'm an American, or I'm a Nigerian, or I'm French, and be proud of that association with my country. And it's also good to preserve that cultural identity, and to say, I want my children to learn about my cultural songs and about my cultural practices and about the heroes of our culture. That's a good thing, to pass on that cultural heritage and want to preserve it and not to dilute it. But then there are two extremes that we can go to. One is called jingoism. It's kind of a weird term. But basically, jingoism is a blind commitment to a nation regardless of the morality. And this is what we saw in Germany and in Japan, how even when their countries were doing horrendously wrong things, they thought they were being patriotic by supporting Hitler or by supporting the emperor and supporting those wrong things. So when patriotism goes wrong is when it backs up the country even when it does horrible things. Also, it's wrong when it treats other people groups unethically. So when, for example, the Americans in the 18th century and 19th century looked at the Native Americans and said they are a lower class, or they are dumb, or they aren't worth what we're worth, we're so much better than them. That is a wrong patriotism. That's jingoism, when it then treats those other cultures as inferior to my culture because I'm better than every other culture. And it refuses to, the third point there, you elevate your own culture so high that you fail to recognize the goodness of other cultures and you don't see any of the faults in your own culture. So our patriotism can rejoice in the good things of our culture and want to preserve those good things, but it also should recognize we've made mistakes and we're making mistakes, and there are some ways in which our culture could learn and become more like other cultures. And there are other cultures that have succeeded a lot more in certain areas. Globalism is the other extreme. So jingoism is saying my culture is the best in every way, every other culture is trash. Globalism says every other culture is just as good as my culture in every way. Therefore, there's no need to pass on my culture or to be proud of the things that my culture has done, or to say that in some ways my culture might be better than other cultures. Every culture is equal, so really what that ends up doing is saying there's no need for any culture. And you just have this one world utopian social order. So we have to have the balance. Remember, a lot of times it always wants to go in one direction or the other direction. So we don't want to go into jingoism where you have Nazis and white supremacy and all of that. But we don't want to go to globalism that says that culture doesn't matter at all and no culture is better than any other culture in any way. We have to realize every culture has good elements. Every culture has bad elements. And it is true that some cultures have more good than other cultures. When someone's a nationalist, they end up writing their history according to the nationalists, and what we call nationalistic history. This has happened in many different countries, and basically what happens is the historians in that country choose to interpret their events to make their nations look good. So, for example, in a history of the United States, they might only talk about the good things the United States did and then don't mention any of the bad things the United States did. And try to reinterpret everything to make the United States look good in every way. And this is called Whig history. It is also used many times to promote what we're trying to do right now. So, for example, a Republican might say, we are the party of Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass. Well, is that true? Yes, that's true, in the sense that they were both Republicans. But is it correct to say that therefore Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass would have supported everything that the Republicans are doing today? Because the Republican Party in the 1800s was exactly the same as the Republican Party in 2020. No. That's Whig history. It's trying to say that everything that Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass did as Republicans would have been the same as we do today. So it basically looks for historical persons and events to back up what they're doing now. And this is a really big temptation, even for Christians. It's really easy for us to look back at a quote by a historical figure that everyone looks up to, like Washington or Lincoln or one of these people, and interpret it in light of what we mean by it today, instead of trying to understand what they would have meant by it in their day and interpret it correctly instead of just taking it out of context to support our view. studies the past with reference to the present, and it just tries to glorify what I'm doing right now by backing it up by misinterpreting the past. Problems with Whig history. Obviously, there are a lot of different problems we can mention. First of all, we have to treat other cultures as people who are created in the image of God and love them as we love ourselves. Leviticus talks about loving our neighbor as ourselves. We have to be careful not to rewrite history so that it backs up our views, even if they're good views. We have to make sure that we are being honest and true. Again, Proverbs 12:22 says, lying lips are an abomination to the Lord, but those who act faithfully are his delight. As Christians especially, we have to be really careful to be true in everything that we do and not fall into the temptation of just picking and choosing the things that we like and interpreting historical figures as if they would always back us up. We must admit the errors of heroes while giving honor to their accomplishments and point out the errors in evil people while still painting them truthfully. So there is something called a hagiography. Hagios comes from the Greek word holy or saint. So a hagiography basically is a biography that acts like the person they are writing about is a saint. And it's really easy to do this for people we really respect, because there are a lot of people that rightfully we want to emphasize the good things that they did and give them honor for the good things that they did. But we have to be careful to not make it seem like those people were perfect, and we have to be careful to not overlook the bad things that they did. So for example, in writing a biography about George Washington, we can talk about a lot of the good things that he did and be grateful and honor him for the good things that he did, while also looking at some of the things that he did wrong, such as allowing slavery and having slaves, and say in those areas he was evil and he did wrong. A lot of times we want everything to be simple. We want people to either be heroes or villains, and the heroes do everything right and the villains do everything wrong. But we have to realize that everyone, even the worst villains of history, did some good things and made some good choices. And we have to evaluate people not as good or bad, but evaluate them by their individual choices. So this choice was good, this choice was bad. I mentioned before the biography I was reading of the Liberator, this man who was an American soldier in World War II, and some of the really brave and heroic things that he did. One time he was under really, really severe fire, and his men were being injured and killed, and he was in a tank. And he would have been fine if he would have just stayed in the tank, but he saw his men outside who were injured and under severe fire, and he jumped out of the tank and ran out to pick up his men and bring them back to safety, risking his own life, and could have easily been killed. And we should honor him for that decision. But it also talks about how sometimes he made some poor decisions, and how, for example, when they came to a concentration camp, how he wasn't in full control over his men, and some of the men ended up killing the Germans without trial or anything like that. And we have to both recognize the good and say what he did here was good, but also recognize the bad and say what he did here was wrong. The same thing with the Germans. We have to recognize that some Germans actually did good, heroic things, and some Germans did bad things. And some of the Germans did both. And instead of saying this person was a hero or this person was a villain, we have to recognize that every person in history, even the greatest quote-unquote heroes, were evil. And this is one of the incredible things about the Bible. Even the greatest heroes of the Bible, like David or Solomon or Abraham, are portrayed not only by their heroic actions, but also by their evil actions. David talks about his sin with Bathsheba. It talks about his sin with taking the census. Abraham, it talks about his not trusting God and taking another wife, Hagar, that he shouldn't, and lying about Sarah being his wife because of his fear of being killed. So we have to be honest in our portrayal of people of the past to show that, yes, even the best men did some really evil things, and even the worst men did some good things. So that's one of the problems with nationalism and what we call Whig history. Some other problems we could point out as we talk about naturalism and Whig history. Not only do we have these hagiographies where they only talk about the good, but we also must understand how previous generations thought differently than we did. We cannot condemn them for not being modern. We have to realize that they lived in a different time and thought differently than we did, and we have to also be aware of anachronisms. This is where we take something that doesn't belong in that time period and we put it in that time period. So, for example, looking at someone from the 1600s and saying this doctor bled this, let's say the doctors that treated George Washington and bled him, they were terrible, evil people for bleeding him. Well, they didn't understand all the science that we understand today, and they thought they were helping him. So we have to be careful to not think that those doctors in the 1700s would have ever understood everything that we understand now today. Seek to understand the past for its sake, not just to use it to support your ideas. And again, all of us fall into this. There have been so many Christians that I have known personally, and I myself have done this sometimes, that have tried to use history to back myself up without really being honest. Try to see things from their perspective, especially when you disagree with their actions, and avoid oversimplifications. It's really easy to, again, simplify something and say, this is the cause of this, or this person was good, or this person is bad. Always become not true or not completely true. Has America always been a Christian nation? Christians have definitely played a significant role in American history. Political leaders have many times based their decisions on religious principles, but we know that many of the key founders were not Christians. Many of them didn't believe in the supernatural. They didn't believe that Jesus was born of a virgin. They didn't believe that Jesus rose from the dead. And if they didn't believe those things, they couldn't be Christians. But we also have to realize that many of those people, even though they weren't Christians, they were many times basing their philosophy on biblical principles. So we have to be careful not to justify immoral acts of Christian leaders and say, these pastors in the 1700s that promoted slavery, they had a good heart. Well, they might have had a good heart in some ways, but by promoting slavery, they were doing something that was evil and something that was wrong, and we have to be clear in not justifying them and saying that it was okay. So we have to realize that in some ways America was a Christian nation, and the fact that it was based on many Christian principles, but many of the founders were not true Christians. The third major way that history can be misinterpreted is postmodernism. So postmodernism is simply incredulity toward meta-narratives. Remember, a meta-narrative is a big story. It's a story that encompasses all the other stories. It's how we make sense of who we are. So the meta-narrative that we're studying in this book is creation, fall, redemption. There are a lot of other meta-narratives. Again, the meta-narrative of evolution is that we were created by accident, and all of history is a survival of the fittest and simply a passing on of genetic information, and we're headed towards ultimately then the universe is going to end in a heat death where everything ceases to exist. That's the big story. Postmodernism says either there is no big stories or it's impossible to have a big story. So when they do history, they don't like to try to put all of the smaller events together in a bigger story. So in all accompanying story, a big story that relates all the little ones. So instead of having one big story, they want to tell the story of each small group. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with telling the story of a small village or a small town. But biblically speaking, we can put that story and see how it fits in the bigger story. So they would say a history of a small village, and they would say that stands alone. It doesn't relate to any other stories. And they would also say there's no one correct viewpoint. Everyone's going to have a different viewpoint. So during the Cold War, Russia had one viewpoint of the Cold War, America had a different viewpoint, and maybe the rest of Europe had another viewpoint. But none of the viewpoints were right or wrong. They were just different because there is no truth. So there's no way to know what really happened. They looked at history, and they see how many times, like in Whig history, people just take events and use them for their own purposes, and they say, therefore, there's no way we can really know what happened. So they say that the past is not discovered or found. It is created and represented by the historian as a text. In other words, all history is my view of what I want to have happened, or my interpretation, but we will never really know what actually happened. The problem with this is we can at least come to some things that are true. Yes, we may never know exactly what happened, but we can know some things about what happened. So really, postmodernism ends up telling us more about the historian and his interpretation of the events than the actual. So how do we respond to this? We respond in several different ways. First of all, we have to realize that it is true that there are multiple viewpoints. Obviously, a history of the Cold War written by Russians is going to be very different than a history of the Cold War written by Americans. But that doesn't mean that there is not a correct perspective. The Gospels are written by 4 different viewpoints, and they emphasize 4 different things. But that doesn't mean that they contradict each other or are wrong. They just give us different viewpoints. It is true that except for God's word, we can never know something with 100% certainty. But that doesn't mean we can never know anything. Using creational norms, like we talked about in the last chapter, we can come as close to the truth as we can. So multiple perspectives doesn't necessarily mean we do not have the truth, yet we must also realize that some viewpoints are unacceptable, while the postmodern cannot logically reject any viewpoint because we don't know, according to them, everything is their own viewpoint. So we do have to see that certain viewpoints are wrong. For example, in John 18, verse 37, it says, "Then Pilate said to him," talking to Jesus, "So you are a king?" Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. For this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice." Pilate said to him, "What is truth?" In other words, Jesus says, "I am a king." That is the truth. Pilate says, "What is truth?" He doesn't want to accept the truth because it's going to be inconvenient. The last type of history we're going to talk about is class, race, and gender. And really, this is a result of postmodern history. So really, postmodern history usually results in focusing on what they call the people that are marginalized, those smaller histories, instead of looking at the bigger history. But also, besides postmoderns, the others that like to use this is Marxist historians, because they say that history is all about a class struggle. That's what history is all about, the rich people taking advantage of the poor people until the poor people revolt and take over the rich people. So they believe that all revolutions must come from dissatisfied lower classes. The problem is that this just isn't true. In America, the people that revolted weren't the lower classes. Many of them were actually upper classes. And they weren't revolting for the reason that Marx wanted to believe that everyone revolts for. Others, instead of focusing on classes, they focus on gender, like women's history or minorities. This is good because it is true that in many histories, women and minorities and lower classes were ignored. One of those reasons is because for much of history, they weren't able to have a big impact on history. So we focus on the big events, and sadly, many times women and minorities weren't able to have an impact on the bigger events. But it is good for us to learn about what their role was and be able to see their impact. But we have to be careful to not go to the other extreme. Many today have gone to the other extreme of saying that we shouldn't talk about anyone that was rich or any leaders. All we should talk about is minorities or the lower class or women. So we have to have a balance. Again, we shouldn't do like many historians of the past have done and just focus on the rich and the powerful. But we shouldn't go to the other extreme that many are going to today that says completely ignore the rich and the powerful and just talk about class, race, and gender. So we have to make sure we realize that what the real problem is, sin, and that everyone has it, not just rich white males. So who should we study? Everyone. Who should we focus on as being good? every class, every gender, every race. Who should we show the evil that they did? Well, it wasn't just the rich and the powerful that did evil. Poor people, women, minorities also did evil. They did good and they did evil. So we have to be biblical and to have a balance and not go to one extreme or the other extreme. Finally, selection and moral judgments is what we will talk about next time. So we have to realize that fallen history will always result on that. Actually, let's just finish this up. So there's no way a historian can ever include everything that happened. The problem is the fall can influence our selection in a negative way. So every historian, even John, says he couldn't say everything that happened to Jesus. So like we talked about in the last chapter, we have to select. The problem is the fall can influence our selection in a negative way, and many times we're going to end up selecting things that we like and leaving out things that we don't like. So how can we tell if a historian has left out important facts? Well, we have to read other perspectives. This is why it's always important to never just read one perspective. It's always good to read both sides of the issue, and then you'll get a more full understanding. So sometimes historians are so influenced they don't even notice when they're there. So we have to understand that selection is going to have a big part of that. Also, we have to realize that morality is very important. Our view of morality of people's actions can cause us to misrepresent them. So your book talks about how many people look at Puritans as people who never had fun, that only wore black, that basically wanted to punish everyone for everything, but that's not really true. The only reason they believe that is because they didn't agree with what the Puritans taught, so they wanted to build a straw man and represent them in an inaccurate way so that they wouldn't have to deal with their beliefs. The same thing has happened with Muslims. People have gone to both extremes. Some people go to the extreme to say all Muslims are jihadists and just want to kill us, when that obviously isn't true. And others have gone to the other extreme to say that all Muslims are loving and none of them want to kill anyone, when that also isn't true. So we have to evaluate what happens in history by moral standards. All historians are going to do that. All historians are going to say what this person did was good and what this person did was bad. Whether or not they want to or not, they're going to have a moral standard. And again, that standard for us has to be Scripture. It's not whether or not we like it. It's not whether or not most people agreed with it. It's what the Bible says. So we have to realize this history is a very complex task that's made even harder by the fall. We are limited, and many times because of our sin, we don't want to see things from other people's perspectives. Because we are sinful, many times we want to exalt our perspective to an ungodly height. We only select the facts that support our agenda, and many times we evaluate actions based on what we want to believe or what we like instead of what the Scripture actually teaches. So we have to realize that everyone's going to select, but we have to be careful to select not just to back up our opinion, but to give a true perspective of what's happening. And then we also have to evaluate the actions of people in history, whether they're right or wrong, not based on what we like, but based on whether or not it was truly right or wrong according to Scripture. So we'll stop there. That's chapter 20.